3 months ago, the Canadian government purchased 50.4 million doses of the H1N1 vaccine. And 3 weeks ago, Health Canada approved the vaccines. And 2 weeks ago, the mass vaccination program has started. And the pressure to get vaccinated is mounting. And the Canadian Health Minister keeps telling us that every Canadian who wants it can count on having access to a safe and effective H1N1 vaccine. But are the vaccines safe? Are they effective? Do we want them? Do we need them? Is the H1N1 virus really the threat that we are made to believe it is? And the most important question is if vaccines are in fact at all justified. We need to be educated. And we need to be educated way beyond of what the information we get from the media and from mainstream science. So in order to get educated, I'm going to present Dr. Hammer's work tonight and also a lot of context. So let's start at the very beginning and with the question, what are infectious diseases? Well, based on the standard medical theory, infectious diseases are caused by pathogenic, that is disease-causing microorganism. But the theory that microbes cause diseases is one of the most protected medical doctrines of modern medicine. The theory that infectious diseases are caused by pathogenic microbes was established in the 19th century by Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur claimed that he had made the discovery that germs as the air, as he called it, attack a host body like a human organism and cause an infectious disease. And Pasteur's theory became known as the germ theory. But Antoine Béjart, who was a contemporary of Pasteur, made a very different discovery. According to Béjart, microbes do not invade the organism, but microbes are a part of the inner milieu of our organism. So microbes live in harmony with our organism. They live in symbiosis with our organism, and they, as Béjart says, they assist the metabolic process of the body. And Béjart proposed that microbes become only pathogenic when the organism is out of balance. So in other words, when our organism or when our body, our organism is weak or out of balance, then these usually friendly microbes turn into disease-causing agents. And then there was Claude Bernard. And Claude Bernard also disagreed with Pasteur's germ theory. These are Bernard's famous words. Le microbe ne rien, le terrain, c'est tout. So like Béjart, Claude Bernard proposed that it is the changes of the terrain, the changes of the inner milieu that causes these microbes to turn into a pathogenic form and cause an infectious disease. While in the 20th century, it was Günther Enderlein, a German bacteriologist, who detected in blood samples a tiny, small microorganism which he called protides. And he detected, or he observed, that these microorganisms morph into various sizes and shapes when the internal environment of the organism changes. And Enderlein's theory became known as pleomorphism. And what is worth noting is, or mentioning is, that as far as Enderlein is concerned, that these microorganisms, these small microorganisms, are actually necessary for rebalancing the organism. So it's basically Günther Enderlein's theory is based on Béchamp. But we are not finished with Pasteur, because in 1995 there was this interesting professor, Gerald Geeson. He was professor at the time at Princeton University, and Professor Geeson, he published a book, The Private Science of Louis Pasteur. And based on Pasteur's lab notes, Gerald Geeson discovered that Pasteur had in fact published fraudulent data. So he published fraudulent data, and so with his publication, Gerald Geeson revealed basically to the public and to the world that Pasteur had committed scientific fraud. And Professor Geeson, in fact, was not the first who had exposed, or did expose, Pasteur as a liar. There was also the publication already back in 1923 by Ethel Hume entitled Pasteur Exposed. In 1940, there was R.B. Pearson, and he published the book Pasteur, Plagiarist and Impostor. So in spite of the fact that it is clearly established that Pasteur's theory is wrong, conventional medicine and medical science still propagates the false theory. And with the mass production of antimicrobial drugs and of vaccines, the pharmaceutical company is making billions of dollars per year based on a scientific hoax. And all this in collaboration with the FDA, with the United Nations, with the World Health Organization, with governments all around the globe, basically, and with the media. I'd like to draw your attention now to Dr. Rike Gerd-Hamer. Dr. Hamer's research over the last 30 years offers us an entirely new understanding of the nature of infectious diseases. Dr. Hamer is the first who investigated the cause of diseases by taking, or specifically infectious diseases, by taking into account our psyche, so our emotions, but also by taking into account the brain, which Dr. Hamer identified as the mediator between the psyche and the body. Firmly tied into the science of embryology and our knowledge of the development of the human organism, Dr. Hamer made the groundbreaking discovery that microbes do not cause diseases, that microbes play instead a supportive role in the healing process of diseases, including in the healing of cancer. And Dr. Hamer formulated his findings in the fourth biological law of the new medicine. All in all, Dr. Hamer discovered 5 biological laws. And these 5 biological laws explain the cause and most of all the natural healing phases of what we commonly call diseases. So let's clarify, what are biological laws? A biological law is, for example, that every human being starts with, or the development of every human being starts with the fertilization of an egg and with the first cell division after conception. So the characteristics of a biological law is that a biological law is always valid. It has no exception, and it is reproducible in each and every person. So applied to medicine, a biological law means that it is reproducible and valid in each and every patient's case. So we're going to look now at those 5 biological laws of the new medicine of Dr. Hamer's work, and specifically tonight, of course, to understand the nature of infectious diseases. Well, the first biological law states that every disease originates from a conflict shock that catches an individual completely off guard. In German New Medicine, this conflict shock refers to an emotionally distressing event for which we are not prepared and which we could not anticipate. Well, that psychological distress causes diseases is not per se a new discovery. Holistic concepts of medicine have always acknowledged a relationship between emotional trauma and the onset of diseases. But Dr. Hammer's discoveries go far beyond a repetition of this simple truth. Within Dr. Hammer's research, this mind-body correlation is just one detail within a whole, in fact, within a complete system that constitutes a new medicine in the truest sense of the word. And this system of the new medicine consists of 3 levels. It consists of the level of the psyche, of the brain, and of the organ level. And it is particularly the brain level that offers us completely new insights into the cause of diseases. So how did Dr. Hammer make his discovery? Well, based on the premise that all bodily processes are controlled from our brain, Dr. Hammer obtained a brain scan, so a computer tomogram of all his cancer, of all his patients. So a computer tomogram shows layers of the brain taken parallel to the base of the cranium. We have a few examples here. And Dr. Hammer compared the brain scans with his patient's medical record and with the personal history. And he paid particular attention to his patient's recent emotional trauma. And this is what he found. He found that every disease has its own area in the brain from where the disease is controlled. And that each disease, whether it is a certain type of cancer, whether it is a skin rash, muscle paralysis, arthritis, or water retention, or an infectious disease like tuberculosis, candidiasis, hepatitis, or the flu, is linked to the same area in the brain that from where the program is controlled. So in other words, Dr. Hammer found a clear correlation between certain conflicts, how these conflicts manifest themselves on the organ level as what we call a disease, and how all this is connected to the brain. And this is what happens. So when we have a conflict shock, to look here at the details, when we have a conflict shock, the conflict shock impacts in a very specific, in fact, in a predetermined area in the brain. And on the brain scan, we see this impact as a set of sharp concentric rings. And the location, so where exactly that conflict impacts in the brain, is determined by the nature of the conflict. For example, a death fright conflict, for example, triggered by a diagnosis shock, always impacts in the brainstem. It impacts in the area of the brainstem that controls our lungs. A separation conflict, on the other hand, always impacts in the area of the brain that we call the cerebrum, and to be precise, it impacts in the area of the brain that controls our skin. The conflict of not being able to escape always impacts in the so-called motor cortex, which is the area of the brain that controls our muscle movements. So such a conflict of not being able to escape can, for example, be triggered by a traumatic vaccination experience where the child or the baby feels tied down and cannot escape and cannot basically run away. What happens on the organ level? Well, the moment the conflict impacts in the brain, the moment the brain cells receive the shock, the conflict is instantly communicated to the corresponding organ. And instantly, a significant biological special program is activated in order to assist. So I repeat and emphasize, in order to assist our organism in coping with the particular conflict situation. So Dr. Hammer identified the brain as the mediator between the psyche and the body. He identified the brain as the control station from where each and every biological program is controlled and coordinated. In German New Medicine, we view the psyche, the brain, and the organ as 3 levels of one unified organism that always works in synchronicity, that always works as one unit. And we want to understand and keep in mind that it is the psyche that is the leading component of that unit. And since this conflict involves our entire organism, since it involves the brain, the psyche, the brain, and the organ level, we speak in German New Medicine of biological conflicts rather than of psychological conflicts. So not only is this conflict shock an unexpected event in German New Medicine terms, it is also a very subjective event. In other words, it is our subjective way of experiencing that particular conflict that decides or determines which area of the brain receives the shock and consequently what symptoms will result as the conflict. Well, how we experience such a conflict is, of course, a very personal event. It is conditioned by our personal perception of the event, of the conflict. It is determined by our attitude. It is determined by our vulnerability, by our expectation, by our beliefs, and, of course, also by our fears. Well, it is very important to understand the difference between a psychological conflict and a biological conflict in German New Medicine terms. So let's look at an example. Let's say, for example, a woman unexpectedly loses her child. So the loss of a child and the distress of the loss of a child does not necessarily mean that she suffers a loss conflict in biological terms. This woman can also suffer, over the loss of a child, a separation conflict which would involve her breasts that are synonymous for caring and for nurturing. She can also suffer the conflict of feeling powerless, which will involve her thyroid. Or she might have an anger conflict over what happened, and this will involve her liver. She can, of course, also suffer this conflict as a biological loss conflict, which will involve her ovaries. So whether the woman develops breast cancer, or a thyroid condition, or a liver condition, or ovarian cancer, this is determined by what she subconsciously associates with the conflict the moment that conflict occurs. So it is always our subjective feeling behind the conflict that determines what symptoms will occur as a result of the shock. And the moment the conflict occurs, the tissue-related significant biological program is instantly set into motion. So let's look at the second biological law to get closer into this. The second biological law states that every disease runs into phases provided there is a resolution to the conflict. So I'm going to explain this diagram of German New Medicine. And this is what we learn. Before we have a conflict shock, we are in a state of normotonia. Normotonia means that sympathikotonia alternates with vagotonia. So these terms relate to our autonomic nervous system, and really all it means is that during the day we are in a natural state of stress, and during the night we are in a natural state of rest. And Dr. Hammer discovered that the moment we experience such an unexpected conflict, this natural day and night rhythm is instantly interrupted, and we enter the so-called conflict active phase, which is now a prolonged state of stress. And the moment the conflict is resolved, CL stands for conflict resolution, or conflictolysis, so conflict resolution. The moment the conflict is resolved, we enter the healing phase, which is a prolonged state of rest. Well, Dr. Hammer calls this unexpected conflict shock a DHS, or Dirk-Hammer syndrome, which, of course, which is in honor of his son Dirk, whose tragic death in 1978 was the cause why Dr. Hammer himself developed cancer, and which, in fact, initiated his research. So let's look now, what are the signs and what are the symptoms of conflict activity? Well, we all have been there many times, all of us. Typically, when we are conflict active, we are totally preoccupied with the conflict. We can't think of anything else. We can't sleep, we can't eat, right? And we have very little appetite. So we have very little appetite and we can't sleep. But the extra waking hours, so by waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and thinking about the conflict, serves already a purpose. And the purpose is to put us into a mental state and into the perfect condition to find a resolution to the conflict as quickly as possible. Or we call the conflict active phase also the cold phase, because when we are stressed out and conflict active, or in sympathikotonia, our blood vessels are constricted, and as a result, we have cold hands, we have cold extremities. So all cold symptoms, like the shivers or like the cold sweats, only occur during the conflict active phase. Well, the moment the conflict is resolved, we enter the healing phase. And the organism switches basically into vagotonia, into a prolonged state of rest. And this is why we are very tired when we are healing. Fatigue, my friends, is always an indication that a natural healing process is running its course. We call the healing phase also the warm phase, because now in the healing phase, the blood vessels are widened, and as a result, we have warm hands, we have warm extremities, and we might even have fever. So all warm symptoms, so to speak, like fever or inflammation, only occur during the healing phase. So fatigue, fever, and inflammation are, as we all know, all symptoms of an infection, and we want to keep this now in mind. So what happens now on the organ level, and how do these significant biological programs play out on the physical and on the organ level? And this, my friends, is the first time in the history of medicine that we have a system we can work with. And this is the system. If more tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, then the organ responds to the related conflict with cell proliferation. So let's look at an example. And let's look, for example, at colon cancer. Our intestines are linked to, as Dr. Hammer calls it, an indigestible morsel conflict. An indigestible morsel conflict. While animals experience these conflicts in real terms when, for example, a food chunk or a bone is stuck in the intestines. And when this is the case, the intestinal cells around that food morsel immediately start to multiply and to proliferate. And the biological purpose of the cell proliferation is to produce more digestive juices so the food morsel and this food chunk can be digested and can pass. And Dr. Hammer found that we humans can also suffer these indigestible morsel conflict, but most of the time in a transposed sense. So for us, such an indigestible morsel can translate into an insult, or into an accusation, into a betrayal, into a divorce, into the loss of a workplace that we cannot digest, or we feel we cannot digest. And the moment that indigestible morsel conflict occurs, the area in the brain that controls the colon receives the shock, and the program is instantly set into motion. So during the conflict active phase, there will be cell proliferation of intestinal cells forming a colon tumor at the site where this figurative morsel is stuck. Well, as we learned, the psyche, the brain, and the organ always work as a unit. Always work as a unit. So the degree of the cell proliferation and the size of the tumor is determined by the intensity of the conflict activity during the conflict active phase. So if such a conflict is very intense, then the tumor grows very fast and becomes quite big. Conventional medicine calls such a colon cancer a malignant growth. But Dr. Hammer's research shows that diseases are not, or that cancer are not malignant diseases, but in fact meaningful biological processes that have been practiced for millions of years. While other tissues and organs that respond to the related conflict with cell proliferation are, for example, our lungs, our mouth mucosa, the liver, the pancreas, the prostate, the uterus, the kidney tubules, the breast glands, the underskin, the pleura, and the peritoneum. And Dr. Hammer found that this meaningful cell proliferation only occurs in tissues that are controlled from the so-called old brain, which is the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this information is important to understand infections, because this is, my friends, what happens during the healing phase. Well, the moment the conflict is resolved, this meaningful cell proliferation instantly stops. And during the healing phase, the cell proliferation and the tumor, so to speak, is now decomposed and broken down with the help of tubercular bacteria and of fungi that are specialized to do exactly that. In order to understand the beneficial role of microbes that Dr. Hammer formulated in the fourth biological law, we have to understand the following. We have to understand that when our organism developed over time, microbes developed with our organism. And the task and the job of the microbes is to maintain our tissues and our organs and keep them in a healthy state. In fact, every newborn, every baby receives with the mother milk tubercular bacteria, which indicates the biological significance of TB bacteria. And Dr. Hammer found two more important things. He found, first of all, that during normotonia and during the conflict active phase, these microbes are dormant, they are inactive. But the moment the conflict is resolved, the microbes start to decompose the tumor. Dr. Hammer also found that the style and the manner in which these microbes work is in full accordance with evolutionary logic. So fungi and mycobacteria are the oldest microbes. So consequently, they populated the oldest tissue that is controlled from the oldest part of the brain. And as soon as the related conflict is resolved, these fungi and mycobacteria immediately start to remove the tumor. The fact that tubercular bacteria and fungi remove the tumor and the cancer is an indication that A, a cancer is never malignant, and secondly, that the cancer is reversible. In order to understand this even better, I will explain the following. We have to realize that the tumor that develops during the conflict active phase consists of what we could call disposable cells. And these disposable cells, they differ in size and in shape from the original cells. And this is important because since they differ in size and shape from the original cells, the mycobacteria can differentiate them from the original cells and decompose only the cancer cells. But tubercular bacteria are truly remarkable, because the moment the DHS occurs, the moment we have such a conflict shock, the tubercular bacteria start already multiplying. They start already multiplying parallel to the tumor growth. The TB bacteria, they multiply at the same rate as the tumor grows, so that when the conflict is resolved, there will be the sufficient amount of bacteria available to decompose that tumor. Well, now, of course, during the healing phase, we're going to see symptoms. For example, discharge, because the remnants of this decomposing process have to be eliminated through the stool or through the sputum, through the skin or through the urine, depending what organ is healing at the time. Another symptom that is typical that there is bacteria involved are night sweats. And depending on the intensity of the healing phase, these night sweats can be excessive. Healing always occurs in a fluid environment, so there will be swelling, and swelling can cause a lot of pain. And typically for healing, there's also inflammation and fever and fatigue, because keep in mind, our organism is doing the healing phase in a state of vagotonia and a prolonged state of rest. So we see during the healing phase typically tubercular or TB infections, like in TB infections that involve the lungs or the colon. But here we also find candidiasis. For example, candida infections in the mouth or in the colon or in the vagina. Well, what we learned from Dr. Hammer's work is now that infections are not really diseases, but that infections are healing symptoms. While the intensity of the healing symptoms is always determined by the intensity of the conflict active phase. So if a conflict active phase took very long and was very intense, the healing phases will be, healing symptoms like, for example, infection, will also be more intense. If this is the case, gentle interventions might be considered. And with gentle, we mean to slow down the microbial activity and not kill or eradicate these helpful microbes. So there is no killing or zapping of microbes in German new medicine, because if the tubercular or fungi, bacteria or fungi are not available, then the tumor stays in place and encapsulates. And such an encapsulated tumor can be found years later doing a routine checkup, and often decades later, in fact, doing a routine checkup through a lung X-ray, through a colonoscopy, a mammogram, and so forth. And this can, of course, cause new conflict shocks and new cancers. This is the fifth biological law. Every disease is part of a significant biological special program, so of a meaningful biological stance. It created to assist an individual during a biological crisis or a biological conflict, as we call it in German. Well, the Italian oncologist Dr. Simoncini received a lot of publicity for his claim that he had discovered that cancer is caused by a fungus and that he can cure cancer with sodium bicarbonate, which is more known as baking soda. So wherever I find candida, I make the diagnosis of a cancer, so he says. What is interesting is that Dr. Simoncini found the presence of candida fungi specifically in cancers of the colon and in cancers of the lungs, which are organs where fungi typically remove these cancers. So Dr. Simoncini basically confirms Dr. Hammer's discoveries. But Dr. Simoncini, he made the correct observation, but his conclusion was wrong, because fungi do not cause the cancer, but fungi, in fact, remove the cancer. Well, as far as Dr. Simoncini's cancer treatment with baking soda is concerned, we have to realize that he administers the baking soda at a time when the cancer is already healing naturally. So when the cancer is already naturally removed by the fungi. What we also need to know is the following, and this is a little bit disturbing. There is the publication by Dr. Mark Circus, who is a follower of Dr. Simoncini. And this is a quote from Dr. Mark Circus' book. Sodium bicarbonate, so baking soda, will be given to you usually as a drip before and during your methotrexate treatment to help protect your kidneys. What most people don't realize is that methotrexate is a chemotherapeutic drug. So much for the promise or the claim that baking soda can cure cancer. So let's go back to the science and ask the question, why do fungi and tubercular bacteria remove cancers? And Dr. Hammer asked himself the same question. And he found the answer in the science of embryology. And this is a beautiful quote. The science of embryology and our knowledge of the evolution of man is the foundation of medicine. They are the two sources that reveal to us the nature of cancer and of all so-called diseases. And this is the science of embryology, which is the foundation of the 5 biological laws. And this is why Dr. Hammer calls the 3rd biological law the ontogenetic system of tumors, and the 4th biological law the ontogenetic system of microbes. Ontogenetics refers to the development of the fetus during the embryonic stages. And we're going to look at this now, and before we do this, I'm going to introduce you to the biological compass of German New Medicine that summarizes the 3rd biological law. So what we see here is the following, and we have already learned parts of it. We have seen, or we learn, that all organs and tissues that are controlled from the old brain generate during the conflict active phase cell augmentation. And after the conflict is resolved, the cell proliferation or the tumor is broken down with the help of specialized microbes like TB and fungi. The reverse principle applies to all organs and tissues that are controlled from the new brain or the so-called cerebrum. With all these tissues, we see during the conflict active phase tissue loss, meaningful tissue loss, and when the conflict is resolved, the tissue is refilled and replenished with new cells. And now let's look into the soul and to the heart of new medicine, which is embryology. This is a most fascinating part. This here is an image or picture of a blastocyst. A blastocyst is a cluster or a group of cells from which the embryo develops. on the 13th day after conception, so after the fertilization of the egg, the blastocyst divides into 3 embryonic germ layers, which is the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. And during the development of the fetus, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm develop step by step the entire organism. In fact, when the fetus develops, the fetus passes in a highly accelerated speed all the evolutionary stages from a single-celled organism to a complete human being. So let's look now at the details. Well, the endoderm is the first and oldest germ layer. So the endoderm develops all the organs of the alimentary canal from the mouth to the rectum, but also our lungs, the liver, the kidneys, the prostate, and the uterus. And since the endoderm is the first and oldest tissues, all these tissues are controlled from the oldest part of the brain, which is the brainstem. And during the conflict active phase, all these tissues generate cell augmentation, and during the healing phase, the tumor and the additional cells are decomposed and broken down with the help of fungi and tubercular bacteria that are specialized to do just that. Well, the mesoderm is divided into 2 parts. The older mesoderm develops the underskin, which is the skin under our epidermis. Then it develops the pleura, which is the skin that covers the lungs. It develops the peritoneum that covers and lines our abdominal cavity. It lines the pericardium, so our heart, and in female, the breast glands. And all these organs and tissues that derive from the old brain mesoderm, they are controlled from the cerebellum. And because the cerebellum is part of the old brain, that's why we refer to this germ layer as the old brain mesoderm. And during the healing phase, these tumors and this cell proliferation that develops during the conflict active phase is during the healing phase also decomposed and broken down and removed exclusively with fungi and tubercular bacteria, as we see, for example, in the healing of glandular breast cancer. While the new brain mesoderm develops the bones, the muscles, the cartilage, the tendons, the ligaments, our lymph vessel system, the ovaries, the testicles, and the spleen, just to give a few examples. All these new brain mesodermal tissues are controlled from the cerebral medulla. And since the cerebral medulla, that is an interior part of the cerebrum, belongs to the new brain, we see during the conflict active phase a meaningful tissue loss. And during the healing phase, this tissue loss is refilled and replenished with new cells. Well, as far as the microbial activity is concerned, it is all bacteria that are not tubercular bacteria or fungi. They assist now the reconstruction of the tissue loss that occurred during the active phase. So, for example, Staphylococcus bacteria, Streptococcus bacteria, they assist the reconstruction of the tissue that was lost in the active phase. And this is important, namely that microbes never cross the tissue threshold. And this is why we never see tubercular infections in the ovaries, for example, and we never see Staphylococcus or Streptococcus infections in the uterus, because microbes stay at the tissue that they originally populated. while the ectoderm is the youngest germ layer. So the ectoderm develops the epidermis, so our skin. The ectodermal tissue also lines our mouth mucosa. It also lines the milk ducts. It lines the bile ducts of the liver. It lines the pancreatic ducts, the bronchia, and the nasal membrane. We're going to go back to all these tissues a little bit later. And all this ectodermal tissue, which is derived from the youngest germ layer, are therefore controlled from the youngest part of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex. But Dr. Hammer first theorized that viruses must be the microbes that assist now the healing phase of a cortex-controlled tissue. But Dr. Hammer made a significant discovery. He found that all these cortex-controlled tissues, whether it's the skin or our nasal membrane or the bronchia, heal without the participation of microbes. So Dr. Hammer wondered naturally that maybe viruses are not even present in the human body. But based on the genetic system of microbes, he proposed that if viruses were present in the human body, then viruses would, just like TB bacteria and fungi, assist the healing process, in this case of cerebral cortex-controlled tissues. So at this point, he left it open. But the fact is, if viruses were present in the body, then the hepatitis virus, for example, would assist the healing of the liver. The herpes virus would assist the healing of the skin. And an influenza virus would assist the healing of the nasal membrane. So this, of course, opens a completely new debate about viruses, and if viruses are in fact the cause of AIDS, for example, or of hepatitis, or of cervical cancer, of SARS, or of the flu, like the swine flu, right? It also challenges, I should say, the conventional understanding of epidemics and of pandemics. For example, of the Spanish flu epidemic, of the lung tuberculosis epidemic that occurred, both of them occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. It also questions the cause of the AIDS epidemic and, of course, of the purported threat of the swine flu, so to speak. So now let's look at pandemics and epidemics from a German new medicine point of view, and we're going to start with lung tuberculosis. In order to understand lung tuberculosis, we need to know more about the biological program of the lungs. So in order to understand lung tuberculosis, we have to understand the biological program that is linked to our lungs. So the conflict linked to our lungs is a death fright conflict, because in biological terms, the death panic is equated with not being able to breathe. So the moment a death fright occurs, the lung alveoli cells that are in charge of processing oxygen immediately start to multiply and to proliferate, forming a lung nodules or a lung cancer. And the biological purpose of the lung nodules and the lung cancer is to increase the capacity of the lungs so the individual is in a better position and to cope with the death fright. So we keep in mind that during the conflict active phase, such a lung cancer does not show any symptoms. But this changes during the healing phase. The moment the conflict is resolved, these lung nodules and the lung cancer is decomposed with the help of tubercular bacteria. So now we are seeing the typical symptoms, which is tubercular discharge in the sputum potentially mixed with blood, but also painful coughing. But the coughing, of course, allows the remnants of this decomposing process, so the remnants of the tumor, to be eliminated. Typical healing symptoms are night sweats, fever, and fatigue. And this is what is called lung tuberculosis. But as we understand, the magnitude or the intensity of the healing symptoms is always determined by the intensity and the duration of the conflict active phase. So such a healing phase that takes long and is ongoing can cause serious complication, because with the coughing up of blood, with excessive night sweats and extreme fatigue, such an intense healing phase can in fact consume a person and cause death if this goes on over months and months and months. Well, needless to say that during the 4 years of the First World War, millions of people were suffering death frights. And when the war ended, basically masses of people, millions of people went into healing, which caused then the lung tuberculosis epidemic of 1918. But why did so many people die? Well, we have to understand that when tubercular bacteria decompose these tumors, they produce a lot of tubercular secretion, and so tubercular secretion is very high in protein, which is then expelled basically through the sputum. So this causes then obviously protein loss. And severe protein loss can cause severe protein deficiency, which in turn can cause death. Well, because or due to the extreme poverty after the First World War, the majority of people who had lung tuberculosis did not get the sufficient nutrients, not enough protein-rich food needed for healing and for surviving, and as a result, millions and the majority of them died. Well, in 1944, antibiotics were for the first time administered to TB bacteria. So the reason why antibiotics seem to work is that the drugs destroyed the bacteria that were necessary to remove these tumors. So the antibiotics basically prevented another lung tuberculosis epidemic, but by eradicating these helpful bacteria, the lung cancers of millions of people that suffered the death frights through another world war could not be removed and encapsulated and stayed in place. And during routine checkups, basically millions of people that had checkups, over since 1944, were then diagnosed with lung cancer. So that is the reason why lung cancer is the most frequent cancer to this day. Of course, today, lung cancers are often triggered by death frights caused by a diagnosis shock, usually and often by a cancer diagnosis shock that the person associates or experiences as a death fright. So what we're learning here is that epidemics or pandemics occur when masses of people go into healing with the same type of biological conflict. Well, I found this very interesting picture in an article on the website about the war in Georgia. And it shows how a conflict shock can, as for example a death fright, can affect our entire family. So this is a very powerful picture. And it was entitled Death Fright, Georgia-Russia War. This is how I found it. Well, after 9/11, guess what? Lung cancer increased dramatically in the New York area. Well, from the German Medicine perspective and from our knowledge, this was of course expected. But it's not, as it says here on this Google search, that this lung cancer was caused by the dust or by the debris, but that this lung cancer was in fact caused in lots of people by the death frights that masses of people experienced in the New York region and beyond. Okay. So let's look now at the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu also started at 1918, and also many millions of people died of the Spanish flu. So let's look a little bit closer. This is a really great diagram or chart, because what are we seeing? We see that the Spanish flu epidemic started during the last week of September and reached its peak at the end of October. So we, of course, have to ask ourselves, why exactly during this period? And this is why. Because on September 14th, 1918, the German Emperor Karl announced the end of the war. So here's September 14, and this is exactly that shortly after, this is when the Spanish flu started. So we see clearly that this is linked to an emotional distress that people suffered. So what are the symptoms of the Spanish flu? The symptoms are fever, coughing, and pneumonia. So in order to understand pneumonia from German New Medicine point of view, we have to understand and learn now about the biological program of the bronchia. So let's slowly ease into this. Well, as we learned, if more tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, the organ will respond to the conflict with cell proliferation. And as we learned, this meaningful cell proliferation only applies to organs that are controlled from the old brain. And Dr. Hammer found that the exact opposite principle occurs with all organs and tissues that are controlled from the cerebrum. So if less tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, the organ will respond to this conflict with a meaningful tissue loss. And the bronchial tubes, to be precise, the lining of the bronchial tubes are controlled from the cerebrum. And that's why we see tissue loss in the active phase. But what is the conflict that is linked to these tissues? Well, the conflict linked to the lining of the bronchial tube is a territorial fear or fright conflict. Such a territorial fear relates to fears in our domain. For example, fears at the workplace, fears at home, fears in our house, but also to fears in an area where a person or where people experience extreme fear and get very, very scared. For example, in regions or in countries where there is a war. So during the conflict active phase, as I already mentioned, there will be tissue loss process in the active phase. So the biological purpose of the tissue loss is to widen the bronchial tubes so more oxygen can be taken in, which gives the individual puts the individual in a better position, right, to deal with the death fright, to get more oxygen in. Well, as soon as the conflict is resolved, this tissue loss that occurred during the conflict active phase will be refilled and replenished with new cells through cell proliferation. So as a result, during the healing phase, there will be swelling in the bronchia. So typically, this swelling causes also spasm. So there will be coughing, typically painful coughing. There can be inflammation in the bronchia, which is called bronchitis. So depending on the degree of the healing phase, these symptoms can range from light coughing to inflammation of the bronchial tubes, which is called bronchitis, to severe pneumonia. an intense healing phase of, that involves the bronchia can cause serious complications, which is caused by the big swelling in the bronchial tube, by the inflammation, and by the high fever. And this is why so many people died of the Spanish flu, because they went through a long years of conflict activity, of fear and of frights, and during the healing phase, of course, they experienced these really heavy symptoms. So it is the pneumonia really with the water retention in the lungs that caused the deaths of many of these people. So what we need to understand is that these complications, these serious complications, can occur with any flu, whether it's called the Spanish flu or the seasonal flu or the bird flu or the swine flu. This is a typical complication. Before we continue here, we have to ask the question, can diseases be contagious? Can diseases be contagious? According to German New Medicine, the answer is no, because microbes are only active during the healing phase. So fungi and mycobacteria remove the additional cells that are no longer needed, and bacteria, they assist the reconstruction of cells. So when 2 or more people have the same type of symptoms, this indicates that the 2 people are in the healing phase of the same type of conflict. This typically occurs when family members experience the same type of conflict shock. For example, anger conflicts or separation conflicts, abandonment conflicts, or loss conflicts. So when a whole, we have seen the picture with the people with the Georgia War, so when a whole family experience the same conflict, when they go into healing at the same time, then they will, of course, experience the same type of symptoms. Well, also, if we understand that diseases do not originate in the body, but that diseases in fact originate in the psyche, and that basically through a DHS, and that is the brain that initiates or activates a biological response to this conflict, then we also realize that diseases cannot be contagious. Also, Dr. Hammer was in fact not the first who demonstrated that diseases cannot be transmitted from person to person. There was the German physician Rudolf Virchow who demonstrated through experimentation that if live bacteria are transmitted to another person, that the other people do not develop the same disease. In fact, there were audacious researchers, including Virchow himself, who ingested whole germ cultures without developing the disease. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the hypothesis that diseases are contagious is not reproducible and therefore not scientifically substantiated. Or in simple terms, it tells us that we won't get the flu even if somebody has a good and wet sneeze at us, right? Symptoms of the swine flu. Okay, so time to learn all this so we make the right decision when it comes to vaccination, which is obviously a clear no. So this information was in fact issued by a BC Health Service. Look at that. What are the symptoms of the H1N1? Fever. Fever is rare with a cold. Fever of 100 Fahrenheit or higher for 3 to 4 days is associated with the H1N1. Coughing. A hacking. Mucus-producing cough is often present with a cold. A non-mucus-producing cough is usually present with the H1N1. Well, it gets better than that. A stuffy nose. Stuffy nose is commonly present with a cold. A stuffy nose is not commonly present with the H1N1. Imagine that. Sneezing. Sneezing is commonly present with the cold. Sneezing is not common with the H1N1. Well, this is too funny even to comment on that. So I would say we go straight into Dr. Hammer's research and see what symptoms, what's like the common flu, the common cold and flu symptoms, what Dr. Hammer can tell us about this. Well, remember, if less tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, then the organ will respond to the conflict with tissue loss. While the nasal membrane, so our nose basically, the membrane in the nose is controlled from the cerebrum. And that's why this program runs its course. Well, the conflict, the biological conflict, is always linked to the function of the organ. So the function of the organ of the nose, biologically speaking, is to scent and to sniff out potential dangers, okay? Just like animals, to scent and to sniff out potential dangers. So animals, of course, can suffer these conflicts in real terms. For example, when they smell smoke, which is a potential danger, or when they scent the approach of a predator. We humans can suffer these conflicts also in a transposed sense. In fact, in English, we say, I can smell a rat when something is suspicious, when we sense there is something suspicious, or when we sense a threat. A stink conflict, as we call it in German medicine, so a stink conflict can transfer it for us, or we experience that when we feel that the situation stinks. Okay? We say, this situation stinks. I'm fed up with this. I've had it. In fact, in German, we say, mir stinkt's, which means this stinks, or ich habe die Nase voll, which means my nose is full, which clearly indicates we had enough of something. Okay? So what happens? When we have such a scent or stink conflict, during the conflict active phase, there will be tissue loss in the nasal membrane. And the biological purpose of the tissue loss is to widen basically the passageway of the nose, so to speak, so that we are in a better position to identify the source of that danger and of this overwhelming, and to cope with this overwhelming stench or stink, so to speak. So during the active phase, we have tissue loss. There will be no symptoms while we are conflict active with this scent or stink conflict. Well, this changes during the healing phase, because during the healing phase, the tissue loss in the nasal membrane is now refilled and replenished with new cells, and typically with swelling, causing a stuffed up nose. And healing always occurs in a fluid environment, and that's why we have a runny nose. And sneezing is also significant because sneezing allows these byproducts, so to speak, of the repair process to be eliminated. And of course there is fatigue and fever, which is typical for any type of healing. So all these symptoms, stuffed up nose, runny nose, sneezing, fatigue and fever, are symptoms of the common cold, as we all know. But as we learned, the intensity of the healing symptoms is always determined by the intensity and the duration of the conflict active phase. So if that healing phase is more intense, then the symptoms will be more intense, and then we have the flu. Medical science keeps telling us that the flu is caused by a certain type of virus, by the influenza virus, okay? And if it is the seasonal flu, if it is the bird flu, is it the Spanish flu it was, or if it's the swine flu, okay? So they say that the flu is caused by a virus. And often they give these viruses a very fancy name. For example, H5N1 or H1N1. So let's look a little bit closer. What does the H stand for? The H stands for hemagglutinin, which is a protein that is in charge for blood coagulation, basically. So let's do a little bit of reading. Hemagglutinin is a spike-shaped protein that extends from the surface of the virus. The specificity and thus the danger of its strain of influenza virus depends on the particular type of hemagglutinin that it carries. Over a dozen subtypes of hemagglutinin are known. 3 of them, termed H1, H2, H3, you know there is no 5, attack humans. The hemagglutinin shown here is taken from an actual virus of the pandemic that killed so many people in 1918. This looks very convincing, right? Doesn't it? And also very scary, particularly since this protein is spike-shaped, so to speak, right? So what does the N stand for? The N stands for neuraminidase, which is an enzyme. Well, my friends, we are not concerned about names and letters and numbers that are attached to proteins and to enzymes. What we are concerned about is how medical science interprets these proteins and these enzymes and making us believe, that they make us believe that the H1N1 is a virus that causes the so-called swine flu, and that the spread of the virus poses the threat of a pandemic, and that therefore mass vaccinations against this H1N1 is justified. Well, conventional medicine and medical science has a real problem. And the problem is, where are these viruses? These viruses that supposedly cause all these type of viral infections, of the influenza, of hepatitis, of AIDS, of SARS, of polio, and so forth. My friends, let me introduce you to Dr. Stefan Lanka. Dr. Lanka is a German virologist and molecular biologist who received his PhD from the University of Koblenz in Germany. In the late 1980s, Dr. Lanka himself discovered a virus in a single-celled chlorella algae. And when Dr. Lanka was studying the virus, he made a very remarkable observation. He found and he observed that the virus in the algae, so that the virus reproduces itself in the algae, that the virus leaves then the algae and reproduces itself in other algae of the same kind without, and this is the point, without harming the host organism. So Dr. Lanka basically discovered that viruses do not, as assumed, harm a host body or a host organism, but that, as he puts it, viruses have instead a supportive function in the interaction of cells. And this is in full accordance with Dr. Hamer's findings, who found that microbes do not cause diseases, they do not harm the organism, that microbes also play a supportive role. And as we learned, that fungi and tubercular bacteria, they remove tissue that is no longer needed, tissue that developed during the conflict active phase, so mycobacteria and fungi remove them, and all bacteria that are not tubercular bacteria, they help and assist and support the reconstruction of tissue that was lost during the conflict active phase. So as far as viruses is concerned, Dr. Hamer has observed over and over again that our organism does not require viruses for the healing process. So he wondered, as I already mentioned before, he wondered whether viruses are in fact present in the human body. So if viruses exist, see, this is how it says on all the German New Medicine diagrams. So at this point, Dr. Hamer left it at that. And it was Dr. Lanka who provided the answer and the missing link. Viruses, so Lanka, are vital components of simple life forms. They do not exist in complex organisms such as humans, animals, or plants. While in the science of biology, algae are not considered plants because they lack the distinct organs that are typical for land plants. So based on Stefan Lanka's discovery, when he found that viruses do not exist in humans, he started to question the validity of the HIV. And he started to reread the scientific literature that was available to him, while him being basically in the field at this time. He was actually lecturer at the university. So he was starting to reread the scientific literature concerning the HIV. And he was stunned, to say the least, to find that there is no scientific evidence at all of the existence of the HIV, because the virus has never been isolated from a host cell, which is the basic and the main criterion of proving the existence of a virus. Also, the DNA of the virus has never been properly identified. While in the science of virology, it is only legitimate to talk about a new virus if the DNA has been identified. And this was not done with the HIV. Moreover, photographs don't show a virus, but particles of normal cells, as Dr. Lanka puts it. No particle of the HIV has ever been obtained pure, free of contaminants, nor has a complete piece of HIV RNA or the transcribed DNA ever been proved to exist. Dr. Lanka was not the first who exposed the fact that the HIV cannot be proven and isolated. Actually, I recommend to you to go to the website virusmyth.com. This website contains over 1,500 pages with more than 1,000 articles written by renowned scholars that also reveal the same truths. And these are just two quotes I would like to share with you from that site. First, up to today, there is no single scientifically convincing evidence for the existence of HIV. Not even one such a retrovirus has been isolated and purified by the methods of classical virology. Dr. Heinz Ludwig Sanger, Emeritus Professor of Molecular Biology and Virology, Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry in Munich. If there's evidence that HIV causes AIDS, there should be scientific documents which either singly or collectively demonstrate that fact. There is no such document. Dr. Kari Mullis, biochemist who received the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1993. Well, needless to say, that after Stefan Lanka exposed the HIV scam, he was quickly ousted by the academic community. But Dr. Lanka filled lecture halls when he gave his presentations about the HIV scam. And one day, Stefan Lanka had a brilliant idea. He encouraged the public, so encouraged his audience not to believe him and to question the authorities themselves. So thousands of letters were written to local and federal politicians, to health agencies, to university clinics, and to renowned establishments like the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. So thousands of letters were written, but nobody could deliver. Nobody could show any proof or any picture of such an isolated HIV virus. All these people got were reply letters with references to the same old. So armed with these letters, Dr. Lanka went to court. And on January 15, 2008, the judge of the District Court of Dortmund in Germany publicly announced, quote, Dr. Ulrich Markus, the press spokesman of the Robert Koch Institute, informed me that the HIV virus cannot be isolated. This quote is from Dr. Lanker's book. The English translation would be Vaccination, Genocide in the Third Millennium. The book, unfortunately, is not available in English. It's published in 2001 in German. So what the irony is that it was Robert Koch who, in the 19th century, established the scientific criteria concerning when a microbe can be claimed as a cause of a disease. And according to Koch's postulates, a microorganism that is the cause of a disease must be A, found in all cases of the disease examined, prepared and maintained in a poor culture, and must be capable of producing the original infection. The statement of the judge that HIV cannot be isolated exposed now the Koch Institute, which had claimed that a isolated HIV virus, or a picture of the HIV virus, was published in the publications of Robert Gallo, who is the man who supposedly discovered the virus. Well, now, just a few months ago, in March 2006, it was finally official. And this was published in the Natural News. I just have the whole thing for you, and we're just going to pick out the most important sentences here. According to the letter's authors, widespread evidence has now emerged that the studies were not only poorly carried out, but that the results were falsified. Gallo made last-minute alterations to the paper and its results. The letter from the 37 experts includes a letter from Gallo himself, admitting to another researcher that HIV could not be isolated from human samples alone, and a letter from an electron microscope expert saying that there was no HIV virus contained in Gallo's 1984 samples. Well, with this in mind, my friends, this is very difficult to take. Over 20 million people have died of AIDS. Millions of people were treated and are still treated with highly poisonous drugs, including AZT, which is a chemotherapeutic agent with extreme toxicity. So millions of people have lost their life because they were made to believe that AIDS is a deadly disease caused by a deadly virus, and as it turns out, a virus that does not even exist. The sorrows caused by this HIV cover-up are immeasurable. So let's look at AIDS from German New Medicine point of view. This is how Dr. Hammer puts it so well. AIDS is a combination of symptoms that existed already long before the invention of AIDS. We can also say that AIDS is a result of the invention of AIDS, because most of the AIDS symptoms are caused by the diagnosis shock and by conflicts triggered by the fear of the disease. I have a little bit of an overview here for you ready. So typical diseases or symptoms caused by the HIV/AIDS diagnosis shock are the following. For example, these people suffer death frights that cause lung cancers and lung tuberculosis, as we have just learned. An HIV or AIDS diagnosis can cause a fright-scare conflict, causing bronchitis and pneumonia. The people that are diagnosed with HIV and AIDS, they suffer isolation conflicts, which causes kidney cancer. They suffer separation conflicts that causes skin rashes and eczema. also self-devaluation conflicts that cause bone cancer, lymphoma, and leukemia, or attack conflicts that cause Kaposi sarcoma. Well, here I have a quote that really proves that Kaposi sarcoma is linked to the shock of an AIDS diagnosis. For decades, how interesting that is, for decades, Kaposi sarcoma was considered a rare disease that mostly affected men of Jewish heritage or African men. In the last 20 centuries, however, the vast majority of Kaposi sarcoma cases have developed in association with HIV and AIDS, especially among homosexual men. Okay? So we see here how basically disease, so to speak, all of a sudden the incidence increases linked, as we understand here, to the diagnosis of HIV itself. Well, in 2000, Dr. Lanka's story is far from finished. He's an ongoing great activist. So in 2000, Dr. Lanka founded a forum called Klein Aktion, which means in English, actions in small steps. So Dr. Lanka, after he had found out or discovered the HIV fraud, he naturally asked himself whether the claim that measles, rubella, mumps, hepatitis, the flu, and so forth are also caused by viruses was also a lie. So he started to reread and revisit the scientific literature. And it turned out to be the same thing. There was not a single paper that would prove or show the existence of these viruses. And he repeated the same strategy that worked well with the HIV. So this time, thousands of letters were written specifically by mothers who were concerned about vaccinating their children. So the mothers, thousands of women and fathers, of course, they were writing letters again to ask the authorities for proof of these viruses. And it turned out to be the same story. There was no evidence of a measles virus, no evidence of a hepatitis virus, no evidence of any virus. And this is how the parents summarized their statement. We have been asking the authorities, politicians, and medical institutes about the scientific evidence for the existence of viruses that are said to cause diseases and therefore require immunization. We have not received even one concrete answer which provides evidence for the existence of viruses for which we and our children are vaccinated. So this means that children are vaccinated against phantom viruses. In Canada, by the age of 5, a child has already received over 20 vaccinations. In 2006, Thorsten Engelbrecht and Klaus Köhnlein published the book Virus Mania. The book is now available since 2007. And in this book, the two authors demonstrate that scientifically sound evidence for the existence of the viruses that supposedly cause the avian flu, cervical cancer, SARS, BSE, hepatitis, AIDS, or polio has never been provided. Quote, as with HIV, isolating one of these viruses in a purified form with its complete genetic material and virus shell directly from it and then imaging it with an electron microscope has never taken place. So let's look at some of these images of viruses that circulate on the internet and in medical journals. Okay, these are just a few examples. You can Google this yourself. Just Google hepatitis virus and so forth. And that is what we find. Well, what are we seeing here? Well, most of these images look more than artwork than images of a suggested virus. Also, electron microscope images usually appear as grayish or black and white, grayish, brownish, olivish, and so forth. Also, there are different appearances of these viruses, as we can see. So this one is from a German paper, looks specifically scary, doesn't it, right? So these are pictures or images of the so-called swine flu virus. Okay, we see they all look a little bit different. Okay, so whether colored or not, the question we need to ask ourselves is, are these actually pictures of viruses? Okay, answer, Lanka. The photos of the alleged viruses are not showing an isolated virus, but cells or cell particles. Virus mania, right, authors. The alleged viruses are in reality microparticles produced by the body cells themselves. Hepatitis B, okay, picture here, Dr. Lanka. The photo of the hepatitis B viruses, the photo does not show isolated structures, but an agglutinate. This is the scientific term for proteins from the blood that are clumped together, as is typical for coagulation. Typically, therefore, round and also crystal structures depending on the condition of the blood sample. Hepatitis C. Certainly nobody has yet managed to detect a corresponding virus structure in the blood serum of so-called hepatitis C patients. As with HIV, the virus purification necessary for a clear identification has not taken place, my friends. So let's look at hepatitis and what Dr. Hammer has researched and about his discoveries concerning hepatitis. Well, we go back to the rule. If less tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, the conflict will respond to the conflict with meaningful tissue loss. In order to understand hepatitis, we have to understand the bile ducts. So what are the bile ducts? Well, the bile ducts of the liver, they carry bile that is produced in the liver and carry the bile to the intestine where it aids digestion. The conflict that is linked to the lining of the bile ducts is a territorial anger conflict. So anger in our domain, anger at work, anger at home, and so forth. I don't think we have to clarify what we mean with anger. Okay? So territorial anger. During the conflict active phase, the lining of the bile ducts ulcerates, causing tissue loss. The biological purpose of the tissue loss is to widen the bile ducts so there is more flow of bile, which increases the digestion, which in turn increases the metabolism, and which in turn gives the individual more energy needed to resolve the territorial conflict. Okay? So this, my friend, is typical and characteristic for the conflict active phase, that as we learned during the conflict active phase, we are in a state of stress, but it is the state of stress that in fact gives us energy. Okay? We wake up at 3 in the morning, we start thinking about the conflict, we are just go, go, go. Okay? But this we have to see from a positive side. This is what gives us energy. And the same happens on the organ level. So by making a meaningful tissue loss, this program and all the others that we have covered so far, it actually increases our energy in order to be in a better position to cope with the conflict. See? So during the conflict active phase, we have this tissue loss. While during the healing phase, the tissue loss will be refilled and replenished with new cells through cell proliferation, typically with swelling. Swelling causes, for example, an enlarged liver. If the bile ducts occlude because of the swelling in the ducts, this is then called jaundice. And if there's inflammation in the bile ducts, which is typical actually for the healing phase, because these ducts are very narrow, they get easily inflamed. And again, remember, the intensity of the healing symptoms is determined by the intensity and duration of the active phase. So if there's a long, intense healing phase, there is potentially, of course, inflammation in the bile ducts, and this is called hepatitis. So hepatitis literally means inflammation of the liver, and that's all it is. Medical science claims, although there is this serious lack of the evidence of a hepatitis virus, so medical science still claims that hepatitis is caused by a hepatitis virus, A, B, C, D, Z, right? And it's pushing hepatitis vaccines. But what are people vaccinated against? Now let's talk about the immune system. Okay. Conventional medicine views the immune system as a defense system against microbes that invade our organism or against cancer cells that dwell already in our body. In fact, medical science believes that a weak immune system is the cause for most diseases. Conventional medicine views our body as a battlefield, as a war zone, where antibodies and white blood cells constitute an army of killer cells ready to attack the enemy. And the fantasies of modern medicines have no limit. The theory of an autoimmune disease implies or suggests that our body actually attacks itself, turns against itself, and kills its own tissues. But what a pathetic thought, what a sad and poor display of a medicine that is placed on the belief that nature is hostile and antagonistic. Dr. Hammer's discoveries show or reveal or expose, I might even say, this attitude as an outdated belief of an outdated medicine. Because if we learn and understand that cancer is not a disease, but that cancer is a meaningful biological process, and microbes do not cause diseases, but play a supportive role in the healing phase of diseases, then the whole concept of an immune system falls apart. The 5 biological laws of the new medicine clearly show that the immune system theory is a construct, is an assumption based on a false premise. The immune system, let's put it straightforward, the immune system does not exist. What exists, however, is a perfect biological system, a support system rather than a defense system, created to assist us while we are healing. And that support system includes the antibodies, includes white blood cells, and many other chemical processes. While eating healthy, getting a lot of exercises, getting enough sleep, staying away from smoking, staying away from too much stress is, of course, very important. And even more so from a perspective of German new medicine. Because a healthy diet strengthens our organism. It strengthens our system, and which has the advantage also that when we are in a healing phase and have extreme healing symptoms, that these healing symptoms might be much easier, that we can cope with them much better. The benefit of a healthy lifestyle is also, of course, that we are less susceptible to have a conflict shock. But, my friends, the truth is that the healthiest diet and the best supplements cannot boost the immune system. It can boost the system, but not the immune system, because there is no such thing. While vaccination and inoculation is also based on the concept of an immune system, or of an immune system. So if there is no immune system, then the whole idea of immunization also becomes meaningless. Vaccine manufacturers claim that the vaccine contains a weak or attenuated or dead virus that stimulates the immune system and thereby preventing the disease against the person was vaccinated. So let's ask the question, are there in fact attenuated or dead viruses in the vaccines? This excerpt that I'm going to show you, but just take it back for a moment, is from an interview Dr. Lanka gave in 2005 about the bird flu. So we had the same story a few years ago. Okay? The interview was called Dr. Stefan Lanka on bird flu, AIDS, and the corruption of medicine. So are there attenuated or dead viruses in the vaccines? The interviewer asked, it has been demonstrated that the H5N1 at the time can be cultivated in eggs. Is that so? Lanka, extracts which are purportedly infected with a virus are injected through the eggshell into the embryo. Depending on how much is injected and where in the embryo the seemingly virus-infected extract is injected, the embryo dies faster or more slowly. It would die from such injection even if the extracts were sterilized in advance. The death of the embryo is then presented as evidence of the existence of the respective virus. Various vaccines are produced from hen embryos killed in this manner. Can viruses be genetically engineered? Let's read all that. That's good education to make decisions, right? An influenza virus is so important for what's going on right now. Okay? I get emails and every day about bioweapons, viruses are produced in labs and all these kind of things, right? But we have to be careful. We have to really look more into what is scientifically going on and not just getting scared with all the things that come in on top of the H1N1 scare that is a hoax anyhow. So can they be engineered? An influenza virus has never been isolated. A genetic substance of an influenza virus has never been isolated either. All that has been done is multiplying gene substance by means of the biochemical multiplication method polymerase chain reaction. With this method, it is also possible to arbitrarily multiply new, never previously existing short pieces of gene substance. It is this artificially produced gene substance which is presented as a virus. That's all that's happening. But the whole world believes that you can reconstruct viruses in labs. Interviewer, how can a layperson check on this? Well, he gives lots of details, but even simpler is to ask in what publication you can find the electron microscope photo of this supposedly reconstructed virus. There is no such publication. Okay? So let's look at test methods. Well, since viruses, all these viruses that supposedly cause viral infections cannot be isolated and can therefore not be scientifically proven, medical science is using a rather unscientific method in trying to prove the existence of these viruses. The method is to conclude from the rise of antibodies, the presence of the virus, and hence an infectious disease. This method is called indirect evidence. I personally prefer direct evidence. But as the Virus Mania authors put it so well, antibody tests just prove the existence of antibodies and not the virus or particles itself to which the antibody test reacts to. And there's another very disturbing inconsistency. Normally, that's not what we all learn, right? Elementary school, we learn that. Normally, a rise of antibodies is an indication of a strong immune system, but not when it comes to AIDS. When it comes to AIDS, a rise in antibodies is an indication of an immunodeficiency caused by a human immunodeficiency virus. So what are antibodies? Antibodies are proteins. According to conventional medicine, antibodies are produced by the immune system. But if the immune system does not exist, what are then antibodies? But if we simply replace the word immune system with the word support system, then this should not surprise us. Antibodies are in reality soluble blood proteins which play a central role in the healing of wounds. This quote continues, and I don't want to withhold this because some of you might be interested in that part. In a test tube containing an appropriate concentration of acids and bases, minerals and solvents, these blood proteins, also called globulins, will bind arbitrarily with other proteins. Thus, you can make any sample taken from an animal or a person test arbitrarily positive or negative. I'd like to stay with the first part, namely antibodies play a central role in the healing of wounds, because this explains why the antibody level rises during any healing phase. If this is the healing of the nose, or if this is a common cold, if this is bronchitis, if this is a skin rash, or if this is a cancer, that is in the process of healing. So during any healing phase, the antibody level rises. So based on German new medicine and the understanding that there are no diseases but only meaningful biological process, in fact the term antibody itself becomes meaningless because there is no longer a body to fight against. Another point. Antibodies play a central role in the healing of wounds. This also means that the antibody level rises in response to cell damage caused, for example, by the harmful ingredients in vaccines. This is just a small list of the toxins, of the chemicals basically in vaccines. Formaldehyde, highly toxic. Aluminum compounds, mercury, and so forth. So medical science interprets now the rise of antibodies as an immune response to the virus against the person is vaccinated. And this is, of course, obviously a wrong and false conclusion, because the antibody level does not rise as a result of an immune response, because there is no immune system to respond to. But the antibody level rises as an indication that the body is in the process of trying to heal the cell damage caused by the chemicals in the vaccine. So it is the poison in the vaccine that is the real danger for our health, and not the viruses that don't exist. Another important point, because if these chemicals, these toxins, enter the brain, this can cause serious nerve damage and neurological symptoms like paralysis, epileptic seizures, and symptoms of autism, which explains why the incident numbers of autism was shooting up as a result of vaccination of children, right? But in order to understand this better, why toxin actually enter the brain, we have to understand the function of the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a selective filter that prevents harmful substances from entering the brain. Only water, sugar, and fat solubles are allowed to pass through this barrier. While vaccine manufacturers, they are using solvents as carriers. And it is these solvents that literally deliver these toxins and these toxic chemicals into the brain. And this is why, as we just said, for example, autism was dramatically increasing as a result of the mass vaccination of children. Such neurological symptoms can also be caused by a conflict shock, okay, by a traumatic emotional distress caused through the vaccination itself. And I have just a little bit of a summary here for you, just to give you an idea. Symptoms that are triggered or can be triggered by the vaccination experience itself. For example, I have a picture here. Look at that, what these kids go through. Not being able to escape, feeling stuck, feeling tied down, feeling held down, causing paralysis, Guillain-Barré, multiple sclerosis, epileptic seizures. Remember at the beginning I was explaining that this conflict impacts in the motor cortex that controls our muscle movements. So when a child has such a conflict, and the conflict impacts in the motor cortex, causing these symptoms. A child can suffer, even an adult, an attack conflict, right, with the needle going in, scare of feeling attacked, anger conflicts, fear, disgust conflicts causing diabetes or hypoglycemia. Okay? I just can give you a little summary here, an overview. So are vaccines safe? Are vaccines effective? This is the question we started out with. Do we want them? Do we need them? Are vaccinations even justified? The answer is a clear and definite no, because, let's summarize it. Vaccines contain extremely harmful toxins. The presence of viruses in the human body has never been scientifically proven. Based on the fourth biological law, microbes don't cause diseases, but play a supportive role during healing. And most of all, my friends, and this is the new medical paradigm, it is our psyche where diseases originate. So it is our psyche where diseases begin to heal. So with German New Medicine, my friends, we are in control. So I thank you very much.